Okay, so what we're going to be doing today is talking about natural selection and another thing which is called sexual selection, which is some people argue is a different kind of theory to natural selection. Other people argue that it's actually pretty much the same general principle, but the actual thing that selects is slightly different, as we'll see later. So I'll mention that debate when I get to it. So basically today, quite a lot of today's stuff is going to be revision. If you remember, some of the stuff I talked about in the first year in the abnormal psychology lecture, and I briefly talked about genetics. So I'm going to talk about that. To begin with, I'm going to talk about natural selection. Again, if you attended the lecture last year that I did on evolutionary psychology, the first lecture, I talked about peppered moths and things like that. You might remember this, but it's pretty good to go through it and just get a refresher of what the general principles are. So I'm going to talk about that. Talk about variation, because as we'll see, one of the important things about evolution is that there is variation. If there was no variation between individual creatures, there could be no evolution, because variation is the kind of is what supplies natural selection with different kinds of organisms, some of which are more successful, some of which are less successful. Rather scarily, I've got the DNA replication and transcription. I used to do a lot of stuff on this in past years. But it's not hugely important, I don't think, to understand the mechanisms of DNA transcription and what DNA is. It's a good idea to just have a brief idea about it, but if you're talking about psychology, then I think the most important thing is to have a feel for how the selection processes work, natural selection, sexual selection. So I'll talk a little bit about that, but it's very kind of broad brush, because I don't think it's hugely important. It's just good to know that it's there. I've got natural selection there, but I'm going to be talking about that first. Then I'll be talking about sexual selection afterwards. And then briefly, as I mentioned earlier, looking at this discussion as to whether natural selection and sexual selection are two things, or really we should best consider them as being, if you like, different sides of the same coin. Okay, so let's start. Basically, the way that natural selection works is we have things, and let's just think about these things as being organisms for a moment. What I'm saying here, this first sentence, when I say organisms make copies of themselves, is true for some organisms, but not all organisms, and I'll tell you which ones it's not true for later on. But if you think of something like a bacterium or something like an amoeba, that's a kind of relatively simple, single-celled organism, and these simply reproduce by a process of division, as you probably know. If you've ever seen cells dividing, you'll kind of know what kind of happens here. So bacterium kind of hanging out there in its little medium on a petri dish or whatever, and at a certain point that bacterium will split in half, it will divide in half. So where you had one, you had two. Same with an amoeba. And then those two at a certain point will again themselves split in half, so 1 becomes 2 becomes 4, and then that becomes 16, and so on. Now, what happens, even in this very simple situation, if you've got enough bacteria reproducing like that, dividing, most of the time, when one splits into two, those two copies will be identical to each other genetically, because basically their genes divide up, and they produce two genetically identical offspring. Isn't necessarily the quite the right word, but we just call them sisters, for example. They're genetically identical. So they're pretty good. The copying process is really good, and the fidelity of the copying process is good. The copies are pretty much perfect. But occasionally, very occasionally, some copies are different. Now, why might these copies be different? Well, sometimes there are errors in what's called the transcription process, and the copying process. Sometimes there were simply mistakes. I mean, if you imagine, I gave you a piece of text to copy out. Occasionally you would get a word wrong, you might miss a word out, you might get a punctuation mark in the wrong place, that kind of thing. So copying is a difficult thing. To get identical copies is difficult. And sometimes there are errors. But other times there may be things which actually interfere in a copying process. DNA is a chemical. Genes are made from a chemical called DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid. And a chemical can be affected by other chemicals, and it can be affected by radiation. So if there are other chemicals present when the copying process happens, that can change the chemical structure of the DNA, which means that some genes may be different, or it may be a cosmic wave, radiation, something like that. Again, that can affect the copying process and lead to errors. And these errors are called mutations. They're simply errors where the chemical structure of the genes, the DNA, is actually changed by radiation, cosmic waves, cosmic rays, chemicals, things like that. So that can produce these errors. And that's why, incidentally, if you heard of nuclear accidents such as Chernobyl, or after nuclear bombs have been dropped, there are a lot of birth defects, birth abnormalities, stillbirths. That's because radiation has the effect of changing the DNA in germ cells. Germ cells are sperm cells and egg cells, which can cause these errors to happen. And these errors are called mutations. And nearly always, they're worse. The copies, the errors, the errorful copies are worse than the original. Just like if you have a recipe and you have to copy the recipe out, you make a mistake in the recipe, you say, it should be 1 teaspoon of sugar and you put 1 tablespoon of sugar or 1 tablespoon of salt. Usually it's worse. You don't usually improve a recipe by making a mistake in it. But occasionally it might happen that you, instead of adding one spice, instead of adding turmeric, you add coriander or something like that. And actually what you end up with is something which, to your taste, is actually nicer. So that, actually, you would find then that people would, oh, this is lovely, we'll copy the error, if you like. We'll start using the recipe which was different to the original. And that one actually might become more popular because although it was originally an error, people prefer it more. So is the case with natural selection. Most of these mutations, these organisms that are different from the parents, are worse. They're less healthy, they're less fertile, they're slower, whatever criterion you want to talk about. But very occasionally one of these is better. These ones will therefore be more likely to survive because they're, faster, better camouflage. We'll see that in a minute. Whatever. So they're more likely to survive. So these then either outcompete the parent, so they replace the parent. Not the parent, but the form of the parent, the genetics of the parent. They become more successful. So the parents start to decline in number, and the new copies start to increase. Or what we might have is a new species. The old species thrives in one way. The mutation maybe allows the new individual to occupy a different niche because it can eat different foods or catch different insects or whatever it happens to be. So we might have 2 different species when it's together. This is the way that natural selection works. The process continues. So more formally, evolution depends upon, first of all, heritable variation. We have variation, and variation is important. If the copying process was perfect, if nothing could affect the copying process, then we'd all be bacteria or whatever the first organism was, because evolution cannot happen without variation. This variation exists, it's rare, most of the time it's bad, very rarely it's good, and it's passed on to the next generation. The second thing is differential reproductive success. Some variants are more successful than others, where success is defined as the number of offspring left behind. That's simply the way what success means. You're more fertile, so you have more kids. You're more likely to survive, so you have more kids. You're better able at catching food, so you have more kids. You're better able to look after your kids, so you have more kids. So these are the 2 things that are part of the process. That's the formal bit, but just think of it. The recipe example works extremely well for most instances. That might be something you want to bear in mind. I'll rattle through this quickly because I think everybody probably remembers this. The Biston Bechellaria, the peppered moth. I won't make the joke about can you spot the moth on the bark. That's quite an old one. People usually can, but probably not on a screencast. There is no moth. We have peppered and dark forms. That's the peppered moth. The peppered moth predominated in the old days. Going back before the Industrial Revolution, the peppered moth was very, very common. The reason why it's called the peppered moth is it's that kind of speckly colour, and that makes it extremely well camouflaged against wood, which is covered in a kind of plant-like thing called lichen or lichen. And you can see that that's a very effective camouflage. Birds which eat these animals are not likely to catch that one. What happened during the Industrial Revolution is that sulfur dioxide was pumped into the atmosphere, particularly in cities. This killed the lichen. Lichen is very susceptible to pollution. The lichen died, and the lichen was therefore removed from the trees. Trees went from being speckly coloured to being dark brown trees, peppered moths. stand out like a sore thumb. A mutation presumably arose, which led the peppered moth to have a baby which was darker brown colour. In the old environment where there were peppered speckly lichen on the trees, the brown moth would have stuck out again like a sore thumb, so birds would have eaten it. That kept these numbers down. There was a selection for the peppered moth against the brown moth, right? So that's a differential reproductive success bit. Once the lichen was killed, suddenly the brown moth is the one that survives because it's more camouflaged. It's better able to camouflage itself against dark wood, which has been denuded of the lichen by the sulfurous compounds. So now we have a different thing. Now it's the peppered moth that's getting eaten by birds. The number of peppered moth is decreasing, the number of brown moth is increasing. Now we've got the Clean Air Act, the environment's getting better, we start to see the peppered moth coming back. So there is no such thing as a best animal. What matters is how well fit the animal is to that particular environment. In this case, in the top example there, the peppered moth is the best one. That's likely to survive. In the bottom case, it's the brown one. So that's natural selection in action. So variation is extremely important. Where do they come from? I've already mentioned mutations, random changes in DNA, therefore genes caused by toxins, radioactivity, chemicals, and so on. These can all lead to differences, genetic differences. This is one source of variation. Genetic swapping is something that happens. Genetic swapping is something that some viruses and bacteria do. They actually can, almost like a kind of weird sex thing, they kind of meet up and swap genes. Why is that? Because that process leads to more variation, which leads to faster evolution. Picture here, this is, a number of years ago, there was a bit of a panic about so-called swine flu. The reason is because if pigs can catch a particular human form of flu, but humans can't catch a form of flu which is in chickens. So humans become resistant to human flu, but they can't catch chicken flu, avian flu as it's called, bird flu. Now if people live in proximity to pigs and chickens, which people do a lot in certain parts of the world, particularly China, which is where most flus come from, then it turns out that pigs can catch both human flu and chicken flu. Now these two different kinds of virus, when they're in the pig, will swap genes, producing new variations of flu. And suddenly now we get a flu which chicken can catch and a human can catch. We've got no defenses against these flus, so that, like to make us very ill or even kill us. So that's a way in which certain organisms increase variation by using genetic swapping. The way we do it, humans do it, and many other animals do it, is through sex. Sex is an extremely boring thing from the point of view of evolutionary biology. Essentially, sex is a process of genetic mixing. Half your genes come from mum, half your genes come from dad. It's basically like, imagine you've got a pack of cards, mum cuts her cards in half, dad cuts his cards in half, and your kids get 52 cards, half from mum, half from dad. The cards here being the genes, but in gene cases, there's not 52 genes or 52 chromosomes. There's rather more genes and rather fewer chromosomes, more of which later. This process, sex, is almost certainly there to increase variation. One of the things I love about this topic is that we often, psychologists have been studying sex probably before Freud, but it's something that psychologists have studied for a long time. But very few of them, although they've looked at proximate explanations of sex, what is the physiology behind sex, what's the neurochemistry behind sex, what kind of sexual fantasies do people have, all this kind of stuff. Very few people have said, why do we have sex at all? That's what evolution does. That is an ultimate question. What is the evolutionary purpose of sex? One example of one evolutionary purpose of sex is that it provides us with variation. That means our kids are not exactly the same. That means if a disease comes in, which one kid might be susceptible to, the other kids might survive. So this process of variation is a very helpful way of trying to make sure that we're different, that we're in a constant arms race with pathogens, with viruses, with bacteria, with other kinds of parasites. They reproduce really, really quickly. We reproduce very slowly, once every 15 years or whatever. It takes a long time. They reproduce in minutes. So they're changing all the time. So how can we keep up? We can keep up by increasing variation by things like sex. Next, I'll be talking about chromosomes. Thank you.